Hello English literature students. This is an overview of the PowerPoint we've seen already about what we call contexts of production for Twelfth Night. So these are the production conditions that prevailed at the time that Shakespeare wrote and the play was performed, and yeah, that's what we're going to talk about. So one of the contexts of production is always when was a text produced. When you're talking about a Shakespeare play, there are three things you need to think about. When was it composed, when was it performed, and then when was it printed? So usually, or often, there are dates and references that we can say not before this date and not after this date. So that's how we work out the dating of a Shakespeare play. So we can be fairly confident that Twelfth Night was composed after 1599, because if you remember when Fabian and Sir Toby are laughing and joking, one of the jokes they make, not just about the big bed at Ware, is about how many lines on their face they'll get from laughing, and the reference is made to the new map with the augmentation of the Indies. And that new map has been identified as a map that was published in 1599. So the play can't have been written before then, or certainly not that joke. So that gives us an idea of the date after which it was composed. But it had to be composed before the 2nd of February 1601, because we have historical evidence of a performance on that date. And interestingly, that was the religious festival of Candlemas. Given what we talk about with Twelfth Night being related to old Christian festivals that perhaps the new Puritans, the extreme Protestants, didn't like, it's interesting to see there how much watching a play was related to festivity generally. So it was Candlemas, the last day of the long Christmas celebrations that they had in those days. And it was performed in a place called the Middle Temple. I've talked to you about these places before. These are where lawyers, young, single, unmarried lawyers would live and work, eat together and share offices in London. So it would have a big main hall. You'll see a picture in a minute. The first performance, however, was probably earlier than that. Because this was written by Shakespeare, he would have been writing for his own company, and the plays he wrote were first performed at the Globe. So we can say it was first performed sometime in 1600, 1601, by Shakespeare's theatre company called the Lord Chamberlains Men at the theatre they were working in then called the Globe. It's first published in 1623. So it's not a play that was pirated. It's not a play that appeared in other versions. So it's published after Shakespeare's death, and it's very famous. You can see the picture there of the first folio, how massive it is, because you've got a picture of someone's hand there. This is very luxurious, expensive edition of Shakespeare's plays, showing how famous, popular, revered he was as a writer. This was 7 years after Shakespeare's death that the first folio was published. So let's talk a little bit more about the Lord Chamberlains Men. This is to do with the production context. Who are they and why is Shakespeare writing plays for them? So who's the Lord Chamberlain? The Lord Chamberlain is a major post in the court of the monarch. And in Shakespeare's time, it is held by a cousin of the Queen. So that gives you an idea. It's an aristocratic figure, and their job is, well, they control another person who is called the Master of the Revels. How cool is that? Yeah, you don't just have a queen like saying, I need someone to run the money, and I need someone to run, looking after the poor. I need someone to run our fun times and our entertainments. That was the Master of the Revels. And the Master of the Revels was responsible for licensing players and plays, not just at court, but throughout London. And there were only 2 officially approved acting companies in London. So you couldn't just start up a theatre company and go, hey, we're going to put on a play right now. You had to have official government state permission to run a theatre company. In 1595, Shakespeare was one of this newly formed company, the Lord Chamberlains Men. And they're called the Lord Chamberlains Men because officially they are members of his household. He is their master, they are their servants. We're talking about hierarchical society. It's not a democratic society, and so they had to belong to somebody, and he offered them protection as well as support. So Shakespeare and 6 other members of the Lord Chamberlains Men shared the ownership and the profits of the Globe. So they're like literally a company. Like nowadays we talk about, you know, a limited company. They were all shareholders. They all put the money in and they all took the profits out. So that the major actors were members of the company. Shakespeare occasionally acted, but he was also the chief playwright. He wasn't their only playwright, but he was their chief playwright. So what do we know about theatres in London at the time? Can I please remind you that the Globe Theatre that we've got a picture of there is a reconstruction, okay? It's not the original. It's as near as they could put it, and it's as historically accurate as they could make it, but it's only been built in the late 20th century. So that's what we think it looked like. It was owned and operated by the Lord Chamberlains Men. So they owned their own premises. This was their business. And it opened in 1599. By 1600, there were 6 public theatres operating in London. So altogether, there were 3,000 seats available in theatres in London. Excuse me, I know I said there were only 2 theatre companies, but some of them were offshoots of other organisations. We don't need to go into that. Excuse me. Given that the city's population was 100,000 people, it means on a Saturday, up to 20% of Londoners could have gone to watch plays. It wasn't expensive. We're talking about men and women. I think it was a penny to stand. So this is available to everybody. This is mass popular culture and entertainment for the people of the city. That was the public theatres. Okay, there was also, at this point, Shakespeare seems to have been moving towards a lot more writing as well for indoor performance. The same plays, but indoor performances were becoming popular with a different audience. So what happened with indoor performances is these were private places. Not everybody could come in. So therefore you got a higher class audience. It was also more expensive. And these would be in the evening and they'd be lit by candlelight. So very atmospheric. There would be different acoustics. If you think about the Globe Theatre, it had a slight roof, but generally speaking, it's open air. So, you know, you had to make a lot of noise and you had to talk above the crowd and things. In a theatre indoors, you can get more sound, more echo. So we know that Twelfth Night was presented at the Middle Temple, which was lodgings for lawyers. And you can see a picture there of, I think it may even be of the dining hall in the Middle Temple laid out for a theatre production. I have to say, I think the theatre would actually have been at the far end. So if you are all familiar with Harry Potter films and Hogwarts, you've got a good idea of what one of these halls would look like. Long, thin. The important end where the high table is, that's where a play would then be performed. And these would be performed at festive events. And in this case, it was performed at Candlemas. So we sometimes wonder, don't we, how much has Twelfth Night got to do with Christmas, apart from the title, Twelfth Night? Well, here it is being performed at Candlemas, the last celebration, the last hurrah after Christmas. Just some ideas about how people in Elizabethan England felt about plays and going to the plays, and people who acted in plays. So in 1572, there was an act about trying to prevent people who were called vagabonds. Okay, this is dodgy people wandering freely around the country. And what they were really worried about were masterless men. Okay, so I said a bit earlier about hierarchical society, everyone should have a master. Masterless men were slightly worrying because no one was in control of them. What kind of people were they? Fencers, bear wards, i.e. someone who has a bear. You'll still see this in poor countries today, people walking through towns and cities with a bear that they allegedly make dance, and people throw them money. Common players of interludes, so that is actually actors putting on little plays, and minstrels, those are people playing musical instruments and singing, not belonging to any baron or any other honourable person. Okay, so this is not Shakespeare in a way, because Shakespeare did belong to somebody. wandering abroad without the license of two justices. So you have to have permission to do this. And if you're wandering without this permission, you were subject to be grievously whipped and burned through the gristle of the right ear. Nice punishments in those days. And of course, that marks you out then. You can't hide that. Everywhere you go, people think, well, he's a dodgy fella. Yeah, he's got a mark through the ear. Acting for money was banned within the City of London. Okay, the theatres tended to be built over the river, what we call the South Bank. Still exists today in London, the South Bank. And that's where the theatres were built because it was outside the control of the City of London, Westminster and around there. And as a rule, that was quite a Protestant place. The merchants, the rich merchants, tended to have lots of power and control within the City of London, and they tended to be more Protestant than aristocrats. In 1594, that's when officially approved players' companies were allowed, but they had to have an aristocratic patron and they had to have a license. So as we've seen, Shakespeare's was approved by the Lord Chamberlain. Just to put the theatre in context, blood sports were very popular throughout Elizabethan England and even in the cities, and going to watch bear baiting was as popular as theatre going, and it was held in the same locations. So if you look at the image there of a sort of artistic recreation of some poor bear tied to a stake, you can see the way the spectators are is like in any theatre as well. So what would happen is a bear would be tied to a stake and fighting dogs would be released to attack it. And the audience would gamble on the result. And we might think this sounds appalling, but we have to put ourselves into the minds of the time where this was great fun. And here is a quote from the time. "It was a very pleasant sport to see the bear with his pink eyes tearing after his enemy's approach, with biting, with clawing, with roaring, with tossing, and with tumbling." And in Twelfth Night, we have many references to bear baiting, to people in trouble comparing themselves to a bear tied to the stake. Olivia says it about her honour. "You must have tied my honour to the stake, and all your unmuzzled thoughts are now attacking it." That's the dogs with their muzzles taken off. And similarly, the treatment of Malvolio is compared to bear baiting. And literally, we're told he stopped Fabian having a bear baiting. Another thing that we need to think about from the context of the time is the fact of boy actors. Okay, it's very, very significant in this play, given that Viola would have been played by a boy actor who is playing a girl who then disguises herself as a boy. That ambiguity that the play plays on around is a boy like a girl, in what ways is a girl like a boy, in what ways is a woman like a young man, is something obviously that the play jokes about, but was very thought about in Elizabethan England. In a way that we don't think of today, boys and women were often put in the same category. Rather than this gender binary male-female, you had a binary where there were adult men who had all the power, strength, marvellous virility, everything. Women and boys were on the other side of that binary. So, women were forbidden to appear on the public stage in Britain. I've said public stage because in private, like in private homes, right up to Elizabeth's own court, women could perform. Aristocratic women would perform in interludes, in what were called masques. They would say lines, they would sing, they would dance. But that was private. Everybody knew each other. Appearing on the public stage was a step too far, and it's seen as not too far from something like prostitution, because a woman displaying herself to anybody who paid to come and watch, that's what's seen as shocking and shameful. So boys would be apprenticed to professional actors. Yeah, just like any other trade in Elizabethan England, you learnt it by being an apprentice. And you apprenticed from the age of 12 to 21. From what I can find researching this, it's strangely not a lot available. They mostly seem to have been around 16, 17 when playing female heroines. However, it's not like the 16 or 17 of today. Okay, puberty would have been later. And so they would have, well, importantly, they were not adult men playing women. they would have had unbroken voices, and they would have had no beard. And this is repeatedly referred to throughout Shakespeare's own plays. In Midsummer Night's Dream, the little lad in the amateur theatre company says, "Faith, let me not play a woman, for I have a beard coming." Yeah, so it's quite clear you can't have been through puberty if you're going to play a woman. So I go on about this quite a lot. It makes me mad when you see full-grown men playing women in Shakespeare's plays and saying, "Oh, this is what happened in Shakespeare's time." This is not what happened in Shakespeare's time. Prepubescent boys played women. Given how few roles there are for women in Shakespeare, men taking those roles too is a little bit annoying. Just saying. Okay, so boy actors would have played Viola, Olivia and Margaret in Twelfth Night. And here is a picture of the last boy actor of female roles. This is 60 years after Twelfth Night, and his name was Edward Kynaston. And 1660, side note, was when the King Charles I was restored to the throne after Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans banned theatre completely. And he was the chap who said women could appear on stage, and under Charles I, then you got women on stage. So that was why he was the last boy actor. You didn't need them anymore.